dial that could change the course of history.
I will correct them all.
You stole it.
Then you
Stole it. It's called capitalism.
fasten your seatbelts.
Chances. Made your mistakes. A final triumph.
Indiana Jones. A few times in my life I've seen. I've been tortured with food, shot 9 times, including once. Sorry.
Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, complete film analysis and explanations. The 2023 release, directed by James Mangold and starring Harrison Ford, serves as a deliberate, melancholic coda to one of cinema's most beloved adventure franchises. This analysis will deconstruct the film's thematic core, its character trajectories, the mechanics of its MacGuffin, the controversial technical choices, and its place within the larger Indiana Jones legacy. The film opens not in the present day, but deep within the past, a choice that immediately establishes its central preoccupation with time, memory, and the ghosts that haunt its protagonist. The prologue, set in 1944, is a digital resurrection, presenting a younger Indiana Jones in full, swashbuckling form, battling Nazis on a speeding train. This sequence functions as a thesis statement, showing us the hero we remember before the narrative systematically dismantles that very iconography over the subsequent 2.5 hours. The de-aging technology employed on Harrison Ford for this extended opening is not merely a gimmick, it is a narrative argument made visible. The visual effect, created by industrial light and magic using a composite of newly shot performance and archival footage of Ford from the original trilogy, is technically staggering yet emotionally dissonant. We see a youthful face, but the voice that emerges is the gravelly, aged register of an octogenarian Ford, creating a subtle but persistent uncanny valley effect that keeps the audience tethered to the reality of passing time, even as the image denies it. Mads Mikkelsen's Jürgen Voller is introduced in this prologue not as a simple, sneering Nazi brute in the vein of traditional Indy villains, but as a chillingly intellectual astrophysicist. His failure to secure the Lance of Longinus, a fake religious artifact, immediately clues the audience into the film's metaphysical stance. The power of the divine is a myth, but the power of mathematical precision, embodied by the Antikythera mechanism, is terrifyingly real. Voller sees the dial not as magic, but as a solvable equation, a fatal arrogance that will define his ultimate downfall. The narrative then violently yanks the audience forward to 1969, a temporal shift that is more than just a change of scenery. It is a statement of cultural displacement. Indiana Jones awakens in a New York City that is no longer his, surrounded by the blaring music of the counterculture, the moon landing celebration, and a generation that views his brand of rugged, World War II-era heroism as a dusty relic. The film brilliantly weaponizes the setting to externalize Indy's internal state of obsolescence. Harrison Ford's performance as a septuagenarian Indiana Jones is the most emotionally naked work he has ever done in the role. Gone is the cocksure grin and the effortless physicality, replaced by a slumped weariness, an alcoholic's morning ritual, and the hollow eyes of a man who has outlived his purpose. He is a professor lecturing to bored, disinterested students in his underwear, a visual metaphor for a man stripped of his armor and relevance, going through the motions of a life that has lost its center. The tragic fate of Mutt Williams, Indy's son, is the emotional keystone upon which the entire film rests. The revelation that Mutt enlisted in the army to spite his father and was subsequently killed in Vietnam is delivered not with melodramatic flourish, but with a devastating, quiet pain. This backstory retroactively deepens the flawed kingdom of the Crystal Skull, transforming it into the final happy chapter before a catastrophic, off-screen fall, and explains the irreparable rift between Indy and Marion Ravenwood. Marion's absence for the majority of the film is a physical manifestation of Indy's grief. He has pushed away the one person who could share his pain, isolating himself in a prison of his own making. The film understands that true grief is often a solitary, silent destruction, not a cinematic outburst, and it allows Ford to carry that weight in every weary glance, particularly when he encounters reminders of his lost family. Helena Shaw, played with razor-sharp, amoral glee by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, is the film's most divisive and, arguably, most misunderstood element. She is not a simple successor or a female Indy clone. She is a deliberate inversion of the young Indiana Jones, possessing all of his ingenuity, charm, and historical knowledge, but stripped entirely of his ethical core and respect for the past. She sees antiquities as commodities, not as vessels of human story, making her the perfect foil for an aging idealist. Helena's introductory scene in Tangier, where she casually forges documents and sells stolen goods to the highest bidder, establishes her as a creature of pure pragmatism in a morally gray world. Her relationship with her young sidekick, Teddy Kumar, is a cynical mirror of Indy's relationships with Short Round or his own father, based on utility rather than affection. Yet, this facade of selfishness is a defense mechanism, a scar left by her father's obsession with the dial, which she misinterprets as abandonment due to madness. The dynamic between Helena and the now elderly Voller is a crucial triangulation of perspectives on history. Voller wants to correct history's mistakes, Helena wants to profit from history's objects, and Indy wants to preserve and understand history as a lived, immutable truth. The film's climax is a violent collision of these three philosophies, with the past itself rising up to judge them. Voller's plan, to use the Antikythera mechanism to travel back to 1939 and assassinate Hitler to lead the Third Reich to a more competent victory, is a uniquely terrifying piece of villain logic. It is not the desire to save lives or undo a tragedy, but a fascist's ego trip, the conviction that he alone could have perfected a monstrous regime. Mikkelsen plays him not with a maniac's energy, but with the cold certainty of a scientist who believes he has found a glitch in the cosmic code. The film subtly and correctly identifies Voller's Nazi ideology as fundamentally impossible to separate from his scientific hubris. His work for NASA under Operation Paperclip is a bitter historical truth woven into the narrative, a quiet indictment of the real-world moral compromises made during the space race. The image of a Nazi scientist being celebrated as an American hero is the dark underbelly of the 1969 moon landing euphoria, and it feeds directly into Indy's disillusionment with his country. The tuk-tuk chase through the streets of Tangier is the film's primary attempt at vintage, Spielbergian kinetic action, and it represents a significant point of directorial departure. James Mangold forgoes the clean, wide-angle, geographic clarity that was a hallmark of Spielberg's set pieces. Instead, he employs a grittier, closer, more chaotic handheld style, prioritizing speed and spatial disorientation over balletic choreography, a choice that trades coherent thrill for visceral panic with mixed results. Mangold's direction throughout the film is informed by his experience on Logan. He is not interested in replicating the breezy, semi-slapstick tone of The Last Crusade. He is constructing an elegy. The color palette is desaturated, the interiors are claustrophobically shadowed, and the pacing is more deliberate, allowing moments of silence to stretch out so the audience can feel the crushing weight of Indy's accumulated years and losses. Antonio Banderas's Ronaldo, an old frogman friend of Indy's, is a bittersweet cameo that serves a brutally efficient narrative purpose. His brief appearance reminds the audience of the expansive, off-screen life of adventure Indy has led, a world of deep loyalties and unsung heroes. His swift, almost casual death by gunshot is a blunt statement from the film. The old adventurers are dying off, and the world no longer offers them a dignified exit. The film's central MacGuffin, the Antikythera mechanism or Archimedes' dial, is a brilliant subversion of the Indiana Jones artifact formula. Unlike the mystical Ark or the heavenly Holy Grail, the dial's power is not divine but technological, a time-travel device built on gears and mathematics. It is a scientific charlatan's artifact, which perfectly fits Jürgen Voller's godless ideology. The supernatural element, when it arrives, is the film's most profound surprise. The dive sequence to the ancient shipwreck, where Indy and Helena recover the Graphicos tablet, is a masterclass in building tension without modern action movie bombast. The threat is not a shark or a villain, but time itself, the ticking clock of oxygen, the crushing pressure of the deep, and the terrifying, silent swarm of eels that replace the snakes of Indy's past. It's a sequence that proves geriatric action can be gripping when it's rooted in environmental threat rather than fistfights, tapping into Indiana's classic phobia in an intelligent, evolved way. Helena's betrayal of Indy in Tangier, stealing the dial to sell it at a black market auction, completes her initial character arc in a brutally efficient manner. She weaponizes Indy's godfatherly affection against him, leaving him framed for murder. This act cements her as the supreme pragmatist. Her journey back from this moral low point forms the entire spine of the film's second half. The discovery of Archimedes' tomb in the ear of Dionysius' cave is the last great archaeologist scene of the franchise. It shifts the film from a chase picture into a genuine historical mystery. The cleverness of the booby traps, Archimedes' practical use of the grotto's acoustic properties, and the water displacement puzzle involving the dragonflies, is pure classic Indy, a rewarding intellectual victory that his character desperately needed. It demonstrates there's still value not just in his fists, but in his mind. The revelation that the dial does not permit the user to pick any time is the most thematically important plot point in the entire script. Voller's entire philosophy, that history is a flawed narrative that he can edit, shatters against the fixed, mathematical reality of the device. Archimedes designed it not for conquest, but as a homing beacon, a cry for help to the future to bring aid to his besieged city. The past is not a destination. It is a trap. The film's climax aboard a Nazi bomber hurtling through a time vortex is a deliberate descent into pure, unapologetic pulp fantasy. The blending of World War II iconography with the swirling chaos of a space-time rift is a visual spectacle that abandons any pretense of grounded physics. It represents the moment where Voller's calculated science finally, literally, collides with the ontological shock of history itself, a collision he cannot control. The arrival in 212 BC during the Siege of Syracuse is not just a special effects sequence. It is the film's philosophical climax and one of the most audacious creative swings in blockbuster cinema. The Roman warships on the horizon, the Greek soldiers staring in awe at a metal dragon in the sky, and the sudden, terrifying realism of ancient warfare utterly deconstruct the heroic fantasy of time travel. The Nazis are instantly obliterated by Greek ballista bolts, their technological arrogance meaning nothing against the brute reality of the past they sought to desecrate. Indy's meeting with Archimedes is the film's sacred moment. Here, the relic of the past becomes a man, not a myth. Archimedes, a weary old genius facing his own mortality, recognizes the dial he will one day build from the wrist of a time traveler. The film argues that the artifact is not just a historical object, but a conversation across millennia. Their brief exchange, "You're from the future? I'm from the past," is the spiritual core of the film. Indy's desperate plea to Helena to let him stay in the past is the narrative giving Harrison Ford the most vulnerable line reading of his career. "I've lived my life. I'm staying here." It is the confession of a suicidal man, not a curious archaeologist. He sees the ancient world not as a historical Disneyland for tourists, but as a quiet, final resting place where his expertise still has meaning, and where he can finally stop running from the pain of a present that has taken everything from him. The cut on his bloodied hand, mirroring his own lost son, is a silent, devastating testament to his grief. Helena's decision to knock Indy unconscious and force him back to 1969 is an ethical paradox that defines her final arc. She violates his autonomy in the most profound way possible, robbing him of his chosen death in beauty. Yet, she does it out of a love she has only just rediscovered, applying her godfather's own lesson back onto him. That you cannot live in the past, no matter how glorious or painful it may be. It is an intervention, not an abduction. The final scene in Indy's apartment is a quiet, grace-filled miracle of reunification and forgiveness. Karen Allen's return as Marion is not just a cameo but a narrative necessity. The film visually and verbally mirrors the "Where Doesn't It Hurt?" scene from Raiders of the Lost Arkansas. The act of two shattered people sharing a space, with Marion taking the lead in a way she never did before, is the real adventure. The iconic hat grab is not a promise of more adventures, but a symbol of continued life, a stubborn refusal to let the flame go out entirely. John Williams' score is, as always, the emotional connective tissue, and his work here is a masterclass in thematic variation. He doesn't just replay the Raiders' march. He fractures it, plays it in minor keys, slows it down into a funereal dirge, and only lets it soar triumphantly in the very final frames. Helena's new theme is a worthy addition, a jazzy, morally ambiguous 1960s inflected motif that contrasts beautifully with Indy's classic, stalwart romanticism. The film's treatment of the damsel in distress archetype is completely subverted through Marion's return, and Helena's arc, Helena, is physically more capable and emotionally more guarded than Indy for most of the running time. However, the film suggests that true heroism is not physical strength or cynicism, but the emotional vulnerability to open a door and apologize for a decade of silence, a strength Marion must literally lead Indy toward, as he is too broken to take the first step himself. The global box office performance of the film, grossing $384 million against a catastrophic budget of over $384 million against a catastrophic budget of over $300 million, is not necessarily an indicator of the film's artistic quality, but rather a symptom of a broken franchise model. The audience that worshipped Indy had, in many ways, aged out of the opening weekend event cycle, and the younger audience the film needed to capture had no nostalgic investment in the character, a problem the Star Wars sequel trilogy also faced. The Cannes Film Festival premiere, which generated a lukewarm critical response, arguably poisoned the film's initial word of mouth. Reviews described it as competent but unnecessary, a legacy sequel checking boxes. Yet, this critical framing ignored the profoundly anti-commercial nature of its final act. Audiences expecting a safe, formulaic adventure were met with a movie about depression, aging, and a literal flight into a time portal above the ancient Mediterranean, a boldness that mainstream critics often penalize in blockbuster packaging. The political subtext of Operation Paperclip isn't just background detail. It's the moral hinge of the 1969 setting. Seeing Voller, a Nazi, being served by American Black Ops agents as Dr. Schmidt, indicts the systems that enable evil in the name of progress. It frames Indy's physical weakness not just as age, but as a spiritual exhaustion from fighting the same ideological battle for decades, only to see the monsters he defeated rebranded as government assets. The death of Voller and his crew in 212 BC is the ultimate use of a Chekhov's gun of historical theory. These meticulous, scientifically minded Nazis are undone by something they arrogantly dismissed: continental drift. The planet's tectonic plates shifted the coordinates over 2 millennia, a variable so vast and messy that their perfect math was rendered suicidal. They are killed not by a fist, but by the very physics they thought they had mastered. The production design of the 1969 New York ticker tape parade, with its astronauts and confetti, is all the more jarring given Indy's empty apartment. The world celebrates the future and the conquest of a new frontier, while the franchise's hero is trapped in the past, drinking himself into a stupor. This juxtaposition is not subtle, but it is effective in painting a portrait of a man for whom the American dream has soured into a garish, noisy reminder of his own obsolescence. The use of the young Moroccan boy, Teddy, as a sidekick for Helena is a clear narrative echo of Short Round, but with a crucial thematic difference. Teddy is a product of his environment, a street thief elevated by Helena's cynicism. His automatic instinct to steal, lie, and escape is what Helena needs to survive. However, in the climax, Teddy learning to fly the plane becomes a symbolic passing of the torch. He represents a scrappy, globalized new generation that still needs the guidance of elders, not just their skills in larceny. The eel sequence is the film's sly replacement for the snake pit. Rather than putting Indy in a confined space with reptiles, he is submerged in a vast, terrifying abyss filled with creatures that trigger his phobia. This reinforces a physical reality of Dial of Destiny. Indy's body is perpetually out of its element. He can no longer throw a punch effectively. He can't ride a horse without aching. He can't even escape a room without a younger generation pulling him through a window. The action sequences are built not on his triumphs, but on his capacity to survive his body's limitations. Why would Archimedes build a dial that only points to his own time? This question, posed by Helena, is the narrative's final brilliant twist. Archimedes didn't build a time travel machine for later users. He built a distress beacon. The entire MacGuffin was a time bomb designed to literally bring future aircraft into the Battle of Syracuse, as witnessed by the dragon on the tomb. The continental drift wasn't a flaw. It ensured the device always pointed to its creator's specific temporal coordinates in absolute space. The mechanism was never for Valor. It was a shield for Syracuse. The film's director of photography, Fedon Papamichael, employs a lighting strategy of nostalgic decay. The golden, high-key lighting synonymous with Douglas Slocum's cinematography in the original trilogy is replaced with a colder, harsher sunlight that has a slightly overcast quality, even in Tangier. This visual choice strips away the romantic sheen of adventure, presenting a more literal, less glamorous world. It is the visual equivalent of waking up from a dream. The decision to not de-age Ford's voice in the prologue was an artistic risk that paid thematic dividends. Voice is the hardest element to synthesize and the most intimately tied to age. By hearing an 80-year-old man's gravelly tone emanate from a 40-year-old face, the audience is unconsciously prepped for the theme of the film. You can mask the exterior, but the internal toll of time is inescapable. It is an uncanny valley effect that deepens the pathos rather than just distracting from it. James Mangold structures the film as a geographical and chronological spiral, not a straight line. The opening with a de-aged Indy loops back visually. The middle act in Tangier spirals into an underwater wreck. The climax literally spirals through time. This visual and structural spiral represents a life review, a recurring dream that closes in on the single point of greatest pain. Only by hitting the core of that trauma, ancient Syracuse, can the spiral break and return to the center, a New York apartment. Helena Shaw punching Indy in the face to knock him out mirrors an earlier gag from Temple of Doom, Indy threatening Willie. But here, the punch isn't played for laughs. It's a desperate, violent act of love. The sound mixing drops out the music, and we hear the blunt, painful thud of a fist on an old man's jaw. It is a starkly unsentimental rescue, reinforcing that saving someone from their suicidal ideation is rarely a gentle act, but a brutal assertion of their worth against their will. The scene of Indy, tied up and interrogated by Valor's goons, is a remarkable showcase for Harrison Ford's ability to act through stillness. He does not quip his way out. He cannot physically overpower them. Instead, his eyes hold a deep, quiet rage mixed with exhaustion. He has been captured by Nazis for over 40 years across these films. This time, the performance transmits the bone-deep weariness of a man recognizing he is trapped in a cyclical nightmare, fighting a hydra whose heads grow back even in the land of the free. The film's ending is a deliberate, long-held tightrope walk over the chasm of fan service. It could have ended with Indy becoming Archimedes or joining the Greek army. Instead, it drags him back to the messy, mundane present. The final shot of the hat on the drying rack is the correct punctuation. It says Indiana Jones is an identity this man puts on, a role he plays, but the sleeping man in the other room, Henry Jones Jr., is the human being who finally has a reason to wake up tomorrow. The use of time as a literal fluid that can be breached in the sky is a wild visual. The rifts appear like cracks in a glass ceiling. This is less scientifically rigorous than a DeLorean, but far more mythological. It frames the past not as a clean digital transition, but as a violent, elemental rupture. A Caesarean section through the fabric of reality that perfectly matches the violent, messy birth of a new chapter for the hero. Ultimately, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is not an adventure film. It is a depressive's journey toward accepting mercy. It systematically dismantles every fantasy associated with the franchise, the invincible hero, the trinket of unlimited power, the glory of a bygone era, and replaces them with the quiet truth that the grandest adventure is not finding an artifact, but finding the courage to stay alive and sit in a kitchen opposite someone you love, even when you have no idea how to fix what you have broken. The film's opening shot, a slow dissolve onto a darkened, artifact-cluttered room before the Paramount logo, even fully fades, is a directorial statement of intent from James Mangold that visually whispers a farewell before the adventure even begins. We are not launched into exotic jungles or vast deserts, but into a confined, dusty space of memory, a warehouse of a life lived, where the golden trinkets of past glories sit in shadowed vitrines, silent and inert, their power to ignite wonder now dormant. It is a museum of the self, a mausoleum for an identity, and the camera lingers on these objects, a fedora resting on a shelf, a bullwhip coiled like a sleeping snake, a leather jacket draped over a chair. Not with the electric promise of their future use, but with the heavy, elegiac finality of relics being catalogued for a final time before the lights are extinguished, immediately framing the entire narrative as an act of archaeological excavation into the protagonist's own soul. This quiet, contemplative prelude, devoid of any human presence, establishes a funereal atmosphere that clings to the film like a morning fog, informing every subsequent punch, chase, and quip with an undercurrent of existential fatigue. A world where the artifacts now own the man rather than the other way around, trapping him in amber even as the chaotic, neon-lit future of 1969 roars impatiently outside his window, completely indifferent to the legend's gathering dust within. The de-aging technology, wielded so extensively in the 1944 prologue, operates as a profound cinematic paradox that the film bravely refuses to fully resolve, presenting us with a Frankenstein's monster of nostalgia, where the youthful visage is a meticulously constructed digital mask stretched over the octogenarian performance beneath. Every frame of this sequence is a tug-of-war between the audience's desire to see the hero restored to his prime and the unavoidable, subliminal knowledge that this is an illusion, a ghost of a performance, a simulacrum born from terabytes of archival data and thousands of man-hours of animator labor. The effect is most successful in the long shots and the frenetic chaos of close-quarters combat, where the murky, nighttime lighting of the moving train obscures the fine details and allows the kinetic energy of the stunt choreography, a hybrid of a digital double and Ford's own still impressive physical commitment, to carry the rhythm of the action. However, it falters, sometimes spectacularly, in the brightly lit, static close-ups where the algorithm must reconcile the 80-year-old vocal cord's gravelly timbre with the smooth, unlined skin of a 35-year-old face, creating a cognitive dissonance that is less a technical failure and more an accidental Brechtian device, constantly reminding the viewer that they are watching a constructed memory, a deepfake of a bygone era, which ironically serves the film's central thesis that you cannot truly go back. You can only simulate the journey, and the simulation will always carry the ghost of the present within its code. Jürgen Voller, as embodied by Mads Mikkelsen with a quiet, reptilian stillness, represents a terrifying evolution of the cinematic Nazi archetype, trading the screaming, occult-obsessed buffoonery of a Todt or a Donovan for the infinitely more chilling persona of a bureaucratic, systems-thinking technocrat whose evil is rooted not in frothing ideology, but in cold, mathematical certainty. He is a man who has processed the Holocaust and the fall of Berlin not as moral catastrophes, but as logistical errors, variables in a grand equation that could be solved with a better Führer and a clearer scientific vision. A monstrous revisionism that absolves the regime of its inherent barbarism by reframing genocide as a management problem. His post-war absorption into NASA via Operation Paperclip is a stroke of screenwriting genius that grounds his fictional villainy in the deeply uncomfortable, factual soil of American complicity, transforming him from a simple foreign antagonist into a walking indictment of the military-industrial complex's willingness to forgive any sin in the name of beating the Soviets to the moon. His entire persona, from his severe, minimalist wardrobe to his precise, uninflected English diction, is a performance of rationality that masks a bottomless pit of narcissistic delusion. He genuinely believes he can heal the wound of the 20th century by applying a scientific scalpel, not understanding that the wound is the patient, that fascism is a death cult that cannot be perfected, only destroyed, and the film's climax will deliver this cosmic lesson with the blunt force of a Greek ballista bolt tearing through a fuselage. Helena Shaw's introduction in the Tangier auction house is a whirlwind of amoral energy, a deliberate character assassination of the audience's nostalgic expectations, presenting not a wide-eyed disciple eager to carry the torch of archaeological integrity, but a sharp-toothed capitalist shark who has weaponized her godfather's skill set in the service of pure, unapologetic profit. Phoebe Waller-Bridge's rapid-fire, overlapping dialogue, a signature style that can feel grating in the wrong context, is here deployed with precision to establish Helena as a creature of perpetual performance. Someone who talks not to communicate but to distract, manipulate, and stay 3 steps ahead of the moral consequences snapping at her heels. Her relationship with artifacts is purely transactional. She doesn't see the dial as a conduit to history, but as a high-value asset to be flipped on the black market to the shadiest bidder with the deepest pockets. A philosophy that makes her the perfect avatar for a late capitalist, post-colonial critique of the entire treasure-hunting genre itself. She is what Indiana Jones would have become without the anchoring influence of a Marcus Brody or a Henry Jones Sr., a brilliant, rootless mercenary plying her trade in a globalized gray market where antiquities are just another form of untraceable currency laundered through the geopolitical chaos of the Cold War periphery. The emotional architecture of Helena's character, however, rests on a hidden foundation of profound childhood trauma, a wound that the film reveals in layers like the sediment of an archaeological dig, each new piece of information recontextualizing her cynical exterior as a highly sophisticated defense mechanism against the pain of perceived abandonment. Her father, Basil Shaw, was driven to the brink of madness by the dial, a man so consumed by the puzzle of Archimedes that he neglected, or was incapable of providing, the basic emotional sustenance a grieving daughter needed after the loss of her mother, leaving Helena with a toxic inheritance. A genius-level intellect shackled to a belief that historical obsession destroys human connection. This backstory transforms her arc from a simple redemption narrative into a more complex, psychological case study of intergenerational trauma. She is not greedily selling the dial, she is violently excising it from her life, turning her father's demon into a payday as an act of symbolic revenge against the object that stole her childhood. Her gradual reconnection with Indy is therefore not just a goddaughter learning to love her godfather again. It is 2 survivors of the same obsessive-compulsive, academic death drive recognizing each other's scars and slowly, haltingly, learning that a shared language of historical inquiry, once a source of isolation, can become the very bridge that restores human connection and pulls them both back from the brink. The eel-infested shipwreck dive represents the film's most successful fusion of classic Spielbergian set-piece construction and Mangold's grittier, more survival-oriented directorial sensibilities, creating a sequence that thrums with a genuine, gut-level tension rooted in the physical vulnerabilities of an aging body pushed beyond its limits. The underwater environment, a silent, pressure-crushing world of zero gravity and limited visibility, naturally strips Indy of his terrestrial advantages, transforming him from a brawler into a fragile, slow-moving mammal in an alien domain where every breath is a counted resource and every sudden movement risks dislodging the regulator that tethers him to life. The replacement of snakes with eels is a masterstroke of phobia transposition, taking the iconic, "Why did it have to be snakes?" gag and recontextualizing it for a more psychologically sophisticated character beat. He's not just scared of a serpentine shape, he's terrified of the slimy, writhing, lightless, vaginal horror of creatures that inhabit the sunken, decaying wreckage of a forgotten past. A far more potent metaphor for his own dread of being swallowed by the depths of his depression. When the eels inevitably swarm and the ancient wreck begins to collapse, the filmmaking shifts into a mode of pure, breathless claustrophobia, the editing becoming fragmented, the sound design a muffled cacophony of groaning metal and Indy's panicked, wet breathing, and the sequence resolves not with a triumphant explosion, but with the desperate, ungainly, gasping for air survival of a man who has just stared into an abyss and, for a moment, was entirely sure it was about to stare back and consume him whole. The film's geographical trajectory, from the bombed-out bridges of 1944 Europe to the ticker-tape parade of 1969 Manhattan, from the sun-bleached Medinas of Tangier to the silent, crushing depths of the Aegean Sea, and finally to the burning shores of 212 BC Syracuse, maps a journey not just across space, but through the collapsing strata of a man's psychological history. New York in 1969 is a crucible of sensory overload deliberately designed to alienate the protagonist, the blaring rock music, the anti-war protests, and the collective, euphoric amnesia of the moon landing celebration all functioning as a hostile, indifferent organism that has completely rejected the stoic, khaki-clad masculinity of the World War II generation. Tangier, by contrast, initially feels like a nostalgic return to the exotic, chaotic, pre-war adventure playground of raiders. But the film quickly subverts this comfort by revealing it to be a post-colonial maze of moral compromise where Indy's old contacts are dead or disillusioned and the new generation, embodied by Helena, operates on a transactional cynicism that renders his code of honor obsolete. The journey into the sea, then, is a baptismal descent into the unconscious, a willingness to let the old world drown him in its ruins, a suicide mission disguised as an archaeological expedition, which is why his instinct to stay in ancient Greece carries such profound narrative weight. Finally, Syracuse is the bedrock of the entire psychological geology, the deepest, most foundational layer, a pre-Christian, pre-modern world of siege warfare and mathematical genius, where all the accumulated noise of the 20th century is stripped away, leaving only the raw, elemental questions of duty, legacy, and the choice between dying beautifully in the past or waking painfully to a present that still needs you. The relationship between Indiana Jones and his son, Mutt, is the ghost that haunts every frame of this film, a negative space around which the entire emotional narrative constellates, and the decision to kill him off-screen in the Vietnam jungle is a narrative gamble of extraordinary audacity that retroactively asks the audience to reconsider the entire franchise as a tragedy in slow motion. The film does not linger on the details of Mutt's death. It doesn't need to, because the details are written on Harrison Ford's face in every scene, a map of guilt, rage, and bottomless sorrow that transforms the once invincible hero into a walking wound, a father who has outlived his child, the most profound violation of the natural order. The screenplay wisely makes this a point of devastating, character-driven specificity. Mutt didn't just die in the war, he enlisted to spite his father, a final, rebellious act of adolescent individuation that was tragically cut short, leaving Indy with the unbearable weight of knowing his last meaningful interaction with his son was a conflict, a failure of communication now frozen for eternity. This backstory explains the end of his marriage not with melodramatic exposition, but with the achingly human truth that sometimes grief is so immense it becomes a singularity, a black hole that pulls everything, including love, into its orbit and crushes it beyond recognition, leaving two people who once loved each other stranded on opposite sides of an event horizon, unable to reach each other because the gravity of their shared loss has bent the very space between them. The prologue's train sequence operates as a self-contained short film, a high-velocity distillation of everything audiences love about Indiana Jones before the narrative begins its work of gentle demolition. The digital recreation of Ford's younger face is intercut with actual stunt work performed by a body double, whose physicality brings a kinetic authenticity that pure CGI could never replicate. Mangold frames the action with a classical clarity during wide shots, allowing the geography of the train to remain legible even as the editing accelerates. The sound design layers the metallic screech of wheels, the crack of Luger pistols, and Williams' propulsive score into a symphony of controlled chaos. When Indy dons the Nazi uniform as a disguise, it is a visual callback to Raiders that immediately reestablishes his resourceful, improvisational intelligence. The sequence also introduces Basil Shaw as the academic foil, a man whose intellectual obsession with the dial will later prove catastrophic for his mental health and his relationship with his daughter. The Lance of Longinus fake-out is a clever misdirect that establishes the film's skepticism toward religious artifacts, steering the mythology toward the rational, even if the rational eventually spirals into the fantastical. The explosive finale of the prologue, with the train careening off a destroyed bridge, ends on a moment of triumph that the rest of the film will systematically question. The transition from 1944 to 1969 is accomplished through a match cut of Indy's face, the de-aged visage dissolving into the weathered reality of an old man waking from a dream. This single edit condenses 25 years of unspoken history into a jarring, almost violent temporal rupture. The apartment around him is a museum of unfinished business, cluttered with ungraded papers, half-empty bottles, and the conspicuous absence of any personal photographs of Marion or Mutt. The sound of his neighbor's television broadcasting the moon landing bleeds through the thin walls, a constant reminder that the world is celebrating a future he has no investment in. His teaching at Hunter College is a humiliating diminishment from his former prestige, a forced retirement gig where students sleep through his lectures on ancient civilizations. The scene of Indy grading papers in his underwear, Indifferent to the knocking on his door, is a portrait of clinical depression rendered with uncomfortable intimacy. When the students revolt against his outdated curriculum during the ticker tape parade, their protest signs are not just period flavor, but a direct accusation. The old ways of knowing are irrelevant, and so is he. Helena Shaw's entrance during Indy's retirement lecture is staged like a femme fatale walking into a noir detective's office, all confidence and ulterior motives. Her body language is a performance of affectionate reunion that Indy immediately sees through, though he is too emotionally exhausted to mount a proper resistance. Phoebe Waller-Bridge delivers her dialogue with a machine gun cadence that deliberately clashes with Ford's slower, wearier rhythms, creating a generational friction that is as much about acting styles as it is about character. When she casually mentions having studied Indy's work to better loot antiquities, she is articulating a postmodern, morally relativist worldview that treats his entire life's mission as a quaint, obsolete ideology. The film does not endorse her cynicism, but it also refuses to dismiss it outright, instead allowing her to function as a provocateur who forces Indy to defend his principles for the first time in decades. Her father Basil's obsession with the dial is the unspoken wound between them, a shared grief that manifests as mutual suspicion and barbed banter. The FBI's involvement in the narrative, hunting Indy as a suspect in the murders Waller's men committed, introduces a paranoid thriller dimension that reflects the historical reality of J. Edgar Hoover's surveillance state. The government agents who interrogate Indy are not mustache-twirling villains but bland bureaucrats, men so invested in Cold War obedience that they cannot fathom a Nazi scientist hidden within NASA's ranks. This institutional blindness is the film's most pointed political commentary, a suggestion that the victory of 1945 was immediately betrayed by the expedient hiring of the very monsters the Allies had fought. Indy's disgust when he realizes Waller is now a government asset is communicated almost entirely through Ford's eyes, a flicker of the old righteous fury before it collapses back into defeated resignation. The sequence where Indy escapes on a horse through the moon landing parade, mounted on a living anachronism galloping through a celebration of technological modernity, is the most overt visual metaphor in the film, and it lands with unapologetic force. The horse's name, much to Indy's dismay, is a subtle running gag that encapsulates his powerlessness even over his own symbols of heroism. Mads Mikkelsen's performance as Jürgen Waller is a study in the banality of evil, rendered not as a frothing ideologue, but as a man whose absolute certainty in his own intellect has calcified into monstrosity. His glasses, his precise diction, and his soft-spoken explanations of physics create a terrifyingly reasonable facade. When he explains his plan to correct Hitler's mistakes, the horror lies not in his passion but in his pedantry. He discusses genocide as though it were an engineering problem with an optimal solution. Mikkelsen plays Waller as a man who genuinely believes he is the smartest person in every room, an arrogance validated by the American institutions that have given him a laboratory, a new identity, and a mandate to pursue weapons research. His dynamic with his hulking American henchmen is a quiet reversal of the typical Nazi villain hierarchy. They are the dumb muscle who occasionally question his methods, while he is the cerebral nightmare who views them as disposable tools. The scene where Waller calmly shoots a hotel waiter who failed to deliver his breakfast on time is chilling precisely because of its mundanity, a petty act of murder committed with the same emotional investment as swatting a fly. The Tangier sequence introduces a morally complex colonial underbelly to the adventure, moving the action away from European museums and into a vibrant, chaotic marketplace where Helena's criminal network thrives. The old Moroccan city is not portrayed as an exotic backdrop, but as a living, economically desperate environment that produces characters like Teddy Kumar, a street kid whose survival skills are indistinguishable from the criminality Helena has cultivated. The tuk-tuk chase, for all its kinetic chaos, is anchored by the character interactions within the confined space of the vehicle, a pressure cooker of bickering, betrayal, and reluctant teamwork. Mangold shoots the chase from inside the tuk-tuk whenever possible, making the audience feel the centrifugal force of every hairpin turn rather than observing it from a safe distance. When Helena reveals she has already sold the dial to a black market auction, the betrayal is compounded by her flippant admission that she never intended to help Indy. He was merely a convenient means to an end. The auction itself is a fascinating glimpse into the global antiquities black market, a shadow economy that treats priceless historical artifacts as currency for oligarchs and crime lords. Indy's attempt to disrupt the auction by causing a commotion is a rare moment of the old improvisational genius, but even here, his body betrays him. He is quickly captured and bound, reduced to a damsel in distress for Helena's eventual rescue. The underwater exploration of the ancient Roman shipwreck is a sequence that trades the franchise's traditional fear of snakes for a more existential terror. The crushing, silent indifference of the deep sea. The cinematography in these scenes shifts to a murky, green-blue palette that limits visibility to a few meters, creating a constant dread of what might emerge from the gloom. The eels that swarm the wreck are not monstrous, just alien and ancient, their sinuous bodies filling the narrow corridors with a suffocating, writhing mass. Indy's phobia is treated not as a joke here, but as a genuine psychological obstacle he must overcome through sheer willpower, his ragged breathing amplified in the confined space of his diving helmet. The Graphicos tablet they recover is a wax rubbing contained in a watertight case, a fragile, unassuming object that holds the key to the entire mystery. The sequence is a testament to the power of environmental storytelling, requiring the characters to read the shipwreck's layout, decipher its clues, and navigate its physical dangers before they can even begin to interpret the tablet's contents. Ronaldo's presence as the captain of the diving boat adds a warmth and professionalism that makes his subsequent, almost offhand death by Voller's gunmen all the more brutal and jarring. Antonio Banderas invests Ronaldo with a soulful dignity that far exceeds his limited screen time, creating the impression of a lifelong friendship through shared glances and unspoken history. His death is the film's most cynical moment, a statement that the old guard of freelance adventurers is being systematically exterminated by a world that no longer has room for their code of honor. The manner of his killing, a simple gunshot during a chaotic shootout, denies him any heroic death speech or final stand, reducing him to collateral damage in a conflict he never fully understood. The impact on Indy is registered in a single, stricken close-up before the narrative momentum forces him to keep moving, a suppression of grief that mirrors his larger inability to process the loss of his son. The subsequent escape via dynamite fishing is a classic Indy gambit, using practical knowledge rather than brute force, but the victory feels hollow, tinged with the bitterness of another friend added to the long list of the dead. The journey to Greece and the exploration of the ear of Dionysius represents a deliberate deceleration of the film's rhythm, shifting from breakneck chases to a mode of archaeological investigation that honors the franchise's roots. The massive cave, a former limestone quarry shaped like a human ear, is a real historical location that the film treats with appropriate awe, its acoustics becoming a functional element of the puzzle. The discovery of Archimedes' tomb is staged as a genuine scientific breakthrough, with Indy deciphering the mechanism of a water displacement trap using principles of ancient engineering rather than physical dexterity. The wax dragonfly automata that unlock the tomb are a nod to the historical Archimedes' reputation as a builder of mechanical wonders, blending myth and engineering into a unified portrait of a genius ahead of his time. The moment when the tomb opens to reveal Archimedes' skeleton clutching the modern wristwatch from the crashed Nazi plane is a temporal paradox of sublime elegance, a closed loop that simultaneously explains the dial's creation and foreshadows the climax to come. Indy's reverence in the presence of the skeleton, his gentle, almost priestly handling of the remains, reasserts his identity as an archaeologist even as Helena's greed threatens to reduce the discovery to another transaction. The film's treatment of physics and time travel is refreshingly restrained, building its rules around the historical reality of the Antikythera mechanism rather than imposing science fiction logic onto the past. The device is not a DeLorean or a TARDIS. It is a highly specific analog computer designed to predict celestial events and, as the film theorizes, to locate fissures in time that occur during specific planetary alignments. Its limitation to a single destination, the Siege of Syracuse in 212 BC, is not a plot hole but a feature, a reflection of its creator's desperate need for assistance against the invading Roman fleet. The film never fully explains how Archimedes acquired knowledge of future aircraft, leaving the causal loop deliciously ambiguous. Did the crashed Nazi plane inspire the legend of the dragon, or did the legend of the dragon draw the Nazi plane to crash? This paradox is left beautifully unresolved, a mystery that deepens rather than frustrates. The climax aboard the Nazi bomber as it enters the time rift is a deliberate escalation into pure operatic fantasy, the film finally abandoning its gritty, melancholic restraint for a burst of apocalyptic imagery. The interior of the plane becomes a surreal combat zone, with World War II machinery rattling apart as the swirling lights and winds of the vortex tear through the fuselage. Indy's physical struggle with Waller's massive henchmen is the last fistfight of the franchise, and it is appropriately desperate, an old man using leverage, surprise, and sheer stubbornness to survive against a physically superior opponent. Waller's death is poetically just. The man who sought to master time is sucked out of the plane mid-speech, his calculations rendered meaningless by the continental drift he arrogantly dismissed. The moment the plane emerges over ancient Syracuse, the German bomber, suddenly an impossible metal dragon silhouetted against a Mediterranean sky, is the single most audacious image in any Indiana Jones film. A collision of eras so visually and conceptually bold that it justifies the entire 2.5-hour journey to reach it. The Roman galleys that fire on the Nazi plane are not CGI abstractions, but tactile, heavily detailed practical effects augmented by digital extensions, their ballista. Bolts physically tearing through the aircraft's aluminum skin. The soldiers on the beach, Greek defenders of Syracuse, react to the falling plane not with movie monster incomprehension, but with the disciplined terror of warriors facing an unknown weapon of the gods. Archimedes himself, played by Nasser Mamarzia, is introduced not as a mythical sage but as a tired, dust-covered old man directing a siege defense, his genius grounded in the immediate practical horror of war. His immediate understanding that the dial has brought these strangers to him is a moment of transcendent connection, a scientist recognizing the fruit of his own mind across a gulf of 2 millennia. The exchange between Indy and Archimedes, conducted in a mix of ancient Greek and modern English, is a scene of profound mutual recognition. 2 old men, both warriors of the mind, meeting at the end of their respective battles. Indy's plea to remain in the past is the narrative climax of his emotional arc, a confession that his life in 1969 holds nothing but pain, irrelevance, and the endless, grinding absence of his son. He argues with Helena not as a guardian but as a supplicant, his voice cracking as he insists that he can be useful here, that his knowledge of history can actually help these people, that he can die among the marble and olive trees of a world that still makes sense to him. The blood on his hands, a wound from the plane crash, visually echoes the blood of his son that he imagines on his hands, the guilt of a father who sent his child to war. Helena's response, a tearful, furious refusal to let him commit what she recognizes as a form of suicide, is the film's moral center. She knocks him unconscious with a punch that carries all the desperate love of a child who has already lost one father to obsession and refuses to lose another to despair. The return to 1969 is a narrative deflation that is entirely intentional, the wondrous spectacle of Syracuse replaced by the mundane beige walls of Indy's apartment. The absence of the dial, left behind in the past where it belongs, is a quiet metaphor for letting go of the fantasy that one can reverse time's damage. Indy waking up to find not just Marion, but also Helena and Teddy in his apartment is a visual representation of the family he thought he had lost and the new family he has accidentally built. Karen Allen's performance as the older Marion is a miracle of warmth and steel, a woman who has aged into a maternal authority that the younger, Spitfire Marion of Raiders could only glimpse. She does not weep or apologize. She simply begins to fold Indy's laundry, an act of domestic care so intimate and ordinary that it breaks through his defenses more effectively than any grand speech could. The final sequence, a quiet conversation in a messy kitchen, is the bravest thing the film does. There is no villain to fight, no artifact to chase, no bomb to defuse. There are only 2 people who have loved each other for decades, circling the wound of their son's death with the tentative, awkward grace of survivors who have forgotten how to be gentle. Marion's line, "Where doesn't it hurt?" is a direct callback to the "Where doesn't it hurt?" scene in Raiders, but it is transformed from a seductive flirtation into a checklist of physical and emotional damage, an inventory of a life lived violently and a heart broken repeatedly. Indy's response, a list of his various injuries that ends with a choked admission that he is still breathing, is the closest the film comes to a declaration of hope. The kiss they share is not a passionate Hollywood embrace, but a tentative, fragile reunion. 2 people testing whether they still fit together after years of separation and grief. The final shot of the film, Indy's fedora hanging on the drying rack outside his window as the city sounds of New York drift in, is a perfect nonverbal epilogue. The hat is not on his head. He is not wearing the leather jacket. He is not charging off on another adventure. The iconic costume of Indiana Jones has been set aside, the persona of the adventurer allowed to rest. But the hat is not in a museum case either, not embalmed or entombed. It is hanging in the sun, drying after being used, ready to be worn again if its owner ever chooses to pick it up. The film does not end with a definitive period on the character's story, but with an ellipsis, an open door, a quiet suggestion that the man behind the myth might finally have found a reason to stay home. The sound of the city outside, the distant traffic and faint sirens, replaces the triumphant brass of Williams' score, grounding the ending in the messy, unglamorous texture of real life, where the greatest adventure is simply learning to live with the weight of your history without being crushed by it. James Mangold's direction throughout the film is that of a dramatist rather than a showman, prioritizing emotional truth over spectacle even when spectacle is expected. His camera often lingers on Ford's face in moments of stillness that a more restless director would have cut away from, trusting the actor to communicate entire novels of pain in the tightening of his jaw or the distant focus of his eyes. The action sequences, while competently staged, are never the point. They are obstacles that delay the characters from having the difficult conversations they need to have. This approach alienated some viewers who wanted the effortless, balletic joy of Spielberg's set pieces, but it coheres into a unified artistic vision of a world where even adventure has become laborious, a grind rather than a release. The film's production design meticulously reconstructs 1969 not as a nostalgic theme park, but as a transitional space, caught between the faded grandeur of the post-war era and the abrasive newness of the counterculture. The Hunter College campus, with its brutalist architecture and indifferent students, is a far cry from the ivy-covered halls of Marshall College, a visual signal that the institutional respect Indy once commanded has crumbled. The ticker tape parade for the Apollo 11 astronauts uses actual archival techniques in its color grading, matching the slightly faded, slightly oversaturated look of period newsreel footage. The hotel where Voller operates is a slick, modernist space of glass and chrome, a sterile environment that reflects the cold, clinical nature of his scientific evil. Every environment in the film is an extension of character psychology, a physical manifestation of the internal states of the people who occupy them. The thematic architecture of the film rests on three interlocking pillars: grief, purpose, and the ethics of looking backward. Indy's grief for Mutt is the engine that drives his entire emotional trajectory, but the film wisely avoids flashbacks or voiceover, trusting that the absence of Mutt is more powerful than any depiction of him could be. His purpose, stripped away by retirement and public indifference, is the void that the dial temporarily fills, offering him not just a relic to chase but a reason to exist. The ethics of looking backward, embodied in Voller's desire to rewrite history and Helena's commodification of the past, forces Indy to articulate why history matters not as a tool, but as a truth. These three pillars converge in the Syracuse sequence, where Indy is offered the ultimate backward glance and must, through Helena's intervention, choose the painful forward path instead. The film's relationship to the previous four entries is one of respectful distance, acknowledging the broader strokes of canon while refusing to be enslaved by nostalgia. References to the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, and even the Crystal Skull are present but understated, Easter eggs for the faithful rather than plot points for the uninitiated. The character of Salah, played with gentle, aging warmth by John Rhys Davis, appears only briefly, a cameo that serves as a living reminder of the friends Indy has made and the world he has saved. Salah's speech about his children growing up and his adventures ending is a direct emotional parallel to Indy's own journey, a shared twilight of the old guard that the film treats with unironic tenderness. The film's critical and commercial reception reveals a fundamental disconnect between the movie that was made and the movie that was marketed. Trailers emphasize the de-aging and the tuk-tuk chase, positioning the film as a return to form, a rollicking adventure in the classic mold. Audiences who bought tickets based on that promise were confronted with a somber meditation on mortality that, while containing adventure elements, was fundamentally uninterested in replicating the tone of its predecessors. This bait-and-switch is arguably the film's greatest structural flaw, a failure of expectation management that poisoned word of mouth. A more honest marketing campaign might have embraced the film's elegiac nature, preparing audiences for a Logan-style farewell rather than an Indiana Jones-style romp. The score by John Williams, reportedly his final film composition, is a career-capping summation that weaves old themes into new configurations with a master's touch. The Raiders' March appears sparingly, always earned, always transformative when it arrives. Helena's theme, a sinuous, jazz-inflected melody played on violin and piano, is a standout addition to the Williams canon, capturing her slippery charm and hidden vulnerability in a few bars of music. The music for the Syracuse sequence abandons the adventure idiom entirely, shifting into a choral, almost liturgical mode that elevates the historical encounter into something sacred. Williams' willingness to subvert his own legacy, to use the orchestra to ask questions rather than provide answers, is a testament to his unparalleled understanding of cinema's emotional architecture. The film's depiction of time travel as a fixed, closed loop rather than a branching, changeable timeline is a philosophically conservative choice that reinforces its central theme. The past is not a playground. Every attempt to alter history in the film fails catastrophically. Waller's plan to correct the Reich is thwarted by continental drift. Indy's desire to remain in Syracuse is thwarted by Helena's intervention. The only character who successfully interacts with time is Archimedes, and he does so not by changing anything, but by building a device that ensures his own history unfolds exactly as it always has, with the aid of visitors from the future whose arrival was always part of the loop. This deterministic worldview is, paradoxically, a source of comfort for the film. If the past cannot be changed, then guilt over the past is futile, and the only moral action is to accept what has happened and move forward. The relationship between Helena and Teddy functions as a hopeful, if morally complicated, echo of the central father-child relationships in the franchise. Where Mutt was Indy's biological son and Short Round was an adopted companion, Teddy is Helena's accidental ward, a relationship built on mutual exploitation that gradually, almost imperceptibly, deepens into genuine care. Helena teaching Teddy to fly the plane, passing on skills rather than just instructions, is her first truly selfless act in the film, a recognition that she has responsibility for this child that transcends her own survival. When Teddy successfully lands the plane in 1969, it is a moment of earned triumph, a child who has been used and abandoned by the adult world finally achieving agency through the mentorship of someone who chose to stop running. The film's violence is more brutal and less cartoonish than in previous entries, a reflection of Mangold's grittier sensibility and the film's thematic seriousness. People die in this film, not in exaggerated, bloodless movie ways, but in sudden, shocking bursts of gunfire that leave bodies crumpled and motionless. Ronaldo's death is the most prominent example, but the casual murder of the hotel waiter, the execution of Waller's own wounded henchman, and the massacre of the Greek soldiers by Nazi gunfire all contribute to a cumulative sense of violence as tragedy rather than spectacle. This tonal shift is jarring for a franchise built on the relatively bloodless, cliffhanger-style peril of the original trilogy, but it serves the film's larger argument that adventure has a cost, and the bill comes due eventually. The de-aging technology, as deployed in the prologue, represents a transitional moment in the history of digital filmmaking, a technique that is technically astonishing but still falls firmly within the uncanny valley for many viewers. The ILM team, using a combination of machine learning, archival footage, and a body double's performance, created a digital puppet that is convincing in motion but often feels subtly wrong in stillness, the eyes lacking the minute, involuntary movements that signal biological life. The decision to set the prologue mostly at night was a practical one, allowing shadows and firelight to mask the limitations of the technology. The result is a sequence that functions more effectively as a memory than as a recreation, a hazy, half-remembered dream of the hero in his prime, rather than a literal return to 1981. The film's exploration of the antiquities black market, while only a backdrop, raises ethical questions that resonate with contemporary debates about museum collections and cultural repatriation. Helena's clients are shadowy figures from the global elite, purchasing stolen heritage with the same casual entitlement they bring to buying yachts and private islands. Indy's fury at her profession is rooted not in legalism, but in a genuine, almost spiritual reverence for the past and its proper contextualization within the cultures that produced it. This is the core difference between archaeologist and grave robber that the film insists upon. The archaeologist seeks understanding, the grave robber seeks profit. Helena's arc involves learning this distinction not intellectually but emotionally, through her encounter with the living, breathing past of Syracuse. The Siege of Syracuse sequence, in its brief, vivid depiction of ancient warfare, gestures toward a historical epic that the film could have become but wisely resists. The Greek soldiers on the beach are not idealized demigods but exhausted, terrified men defending their homes against an overwhelming Roman force. The film does not romanticize antiquity. It presents it as a place of immediate, visceral danger, where a modern visitor would be as likely to be killed by a stray arrow as to be welcomed as a guest. This demystification of the past is essential to the film's argument. The ancient world is not an escape, it is just another battlefield, and Indy's fantasy of finding peace, there is a delusion born of his refusal to face his own present. The film's legacy, divorced from its commercial performance, is likely to be reassessed over time as audiences encounter it outside the context of opening weekend hype and franchise loyalty. What plays as disappointment in the theater may reveal itself as depth on a quiet rewatch at home, when the absence of Spielbergian magic registers, not as a flaw, but as a deliberate artistic choice. The film's refusal to give the audience what it wants, its insistence on following its protagonist into the dark night of the soul rather than into another triumphant sunset, is the kind of creative risk that mainstream blockbusters almost never take. For this alone, it deserves a place in the ongoing conversation about what franchise cinema can be when it stops pandering and starts telling the truth about its aging heroes. The relationship between James Mangold and the source material is that of a respectful heir rather than a slavish imitator. Someone who understands that the greatest tribute to a beloved franchise is not to freeze it in amber, but to allow it to age, change, and ultimately end. His experience directing Hugh Jackman's final performance as Wolverine in Logan clearly informed his approach to Ford's final performance as Indiana Jones, and both films share a commitment to emotional honesty over fan service. The difference is that Logan was able to close its protagonist's story with a definitive, sacrificial death, while Dial of Destiny, constrained by the different tonal expectations of the Indiana Jones franchise, must find a way to end without killing its hero. The kitchen scene reconciliation with Marion is this film's version of Wolverine's grave, a quiet, unexpected place of rest that honors the character's journey by refusing to give him a conventionally heroic exit. Harrison Ford's performance across the entire film is a career-defining achievement that deserved more recognition than the awards season gave it. He is asked to play a man who has lost his son, his wife, his purpose, and his physical vitality, and he does so without vanity, allowing the camera to see every wrinkle, every tremor, every moment of exhausted defeat. Yet within this broken vessel, the old fire still flickers, visible in the occasional flash of anger at injustice, the quick assessment of a puzzle, the reluctant half-smile at Helena's audacity. Ford has always been an underrated actor, dismissed by some as a movie star rather than a craftsman. But this performance is the culmination of a lifetime spent building a character, layer by layer, across 5 films. When Indy says, "I've lived my life. I'm staying here," the line carries the weight not just of the character's history but of the actor's, Ford's own long journey with this role informing every syllable. The film's thematic engagement with American decline, from the triumphant World War II prologue to the morally compromised 1969 present, is a quiet but persistent critique that runs beneath the adventure plot. The moon landing, celebrated as humanity's greatest achievement, is also shown as a propaganda tool, a distraction from the ongoing horror of Vietnam and the systemic rot of institutionalized ex-Nazis. Indy's apartment, with its peeling paint and overflowing ashtrays, is a microcosm of the American dream in disrepair. The students who protest his teaching are not just ungrateful kids. They are the vanguard of a generation that has correctly identified the failures of their elders, even if their methods are disrespectful. The film does not take sides in this generational conflict. It simply observes that the world Indy fought for is not the world he got, and that grief over this fact is not just personal but historical. The interaction between practical effects and digital augmentation throughout the film is a carefully managed balance that mostly succeeds in grounding the impossible in the tangible. The Tangier chase used real tuk-tuks, real stunt drivers, and real Moroccan locations, with digital effects deployed primarily for cleanup and background replacement rather than wholesale creation. The underwater sequence was filmed in a massive tank with practical diving equipment and actors performing their own stunts where possible. Even the time rift sequence, the most effects-heavy part of the film, relies on practical smoke, wind, and cockpit sets to give the actors something real to react against. This commitment to tangibility, inherited from the Spielberg era, is what separates the film from the weightless, green-screen-dominated blockbusters that dominate the contemporary marketplace. Helena Shaw's arc from cynical grave robber to emotionally present goddaughter is the film's most complete character journey, and it mirrors the larger thematic movement from selfishness to responsibility. Her initial dismissal of Indy's pain as an inconvenience to her plans gives way to a genuine reckoning with the damage her father's obsession did to her, and by extension, the damage her own obsession with profit is doing to others. When she looks through the plane window and sees Archimedes on the beach, her expression shifts from fear to wonder to a profound, almost religious recognition of her own insignificance in the grand sweep of history. This is the moment she stops being a looter and starts being, if not an archaeologist, at least a respectful witness. Her decision to bring Indy home, even at the cost of violence against him, is the culmination of this moral education, a choice that prioritizes his well-being over his autonomy because she has finally learned to value connection over freedom. The role of Basil Shaw, Helena's father and Indy's colleague, is the ghost that haunts the entire narrative, a cautionary tale of what happens when the pursuit of an artifact becomes an obsession that destroys family. Toby Jones plays Basil in the prologue with a charming, slightly dotty enthusiasm that foreshadows his later descent into madness. The dial consumed him, not because it was cursed in a supernatural sense, but because the promise of unlimited knowledge, the fantasy of seeing the past with one's own eyes, is a temptation that the curious mind is poorly equipped to resist. Basil's institutionalization and death are the dark mirror of Indy's own potential fate, and Helena's determination not to repeat her father's mistakes is what ultimately saves her godfather from the same pit. The casting of Shawnette Renee Wilson as Agent Mason, the government operative assigned to track Indy, introduces a brief but potent representation of institutional conscience. Mason is a black woman working within a mid-century American intelligence apparatus that would have been deeply hostile to her presence, and she navigates this space with a professionalism that masks a sharp moral awareness. Her realization that Voller's men are not who they claim to be, and her decision to question her orders, marks her as one of the few characters in the film who prioritizes truth over compliance. Her death at the hands of Voller's men, while narratively abrupt, is the film's final indictment of a system that punishes integrity and rewards monstrosity. The film's final shot of the fedora on the drying rack is a masterwork in visual economy. It communicates everything the film wants to say about legacy, mortality, and the right to rest, without a single line of dialogue. The hat is an icon, one of the most recognizable props in cinema history, and by placing it in this humble domestic context, the film completes its work of humanizing the legend. The hat does not need to be worn to be meaningful. It does not need to be on an adventure to be valuable. It simply exists, a testament to the life that was lived beneath its brim, and a quiet promise that the man who wore it is finally, after all these years, at peace. The film opens with a visual quotation of the Paramount Mountain logo dissolving into an actual mountain, then a swastika-draped train, a gesture that instantly reconnects the franchise to its pulp serial origins, while simultaneously signaling that this installment will reckon with the specific historical evil that birthed the character. This dissolve is not merely a nostalgic flourish, but a declaration of intent, an assertion that the corporate branding, the studio machinery, and the iconography of Indiana Jones are now fused into a single, self-aware cinematic statement. The mountain, a symbol of enduring stability, contrasts with the speeding train, a vehicle of relentless forward momentum, and this tension between permanence and transience will echo through every subsequent frame of the film. The train itself, a massive iron beast hurtling through occupied France, is a mechanical marvel rendered with a physicality that digital environments rarely achieve, its weight and velocity palpable in the rattle of the camera and the urgent rhythms of the editing. By grounding the de-aged prologue in such a tactile, materially dense environment, Mangold mitigates the artificiality of the digital face, anchoring the illusion in a world of rust, steam, and sweat that feels authentically, viscerally real. Within the train carriage, the film establishes its moral geography with elegant efficiency, positioning the Nazis not as abstract villains, but as looters systematically stripping Europe of its cultural heritage, a crime the franchise has always treated as co-equal with mass murder. The crates of stolen paintings and sculptures that fill the carriage are not mere set dressing but silent witnesses, testaments to the industrial scale of the Nazi apparatus of theft, and Indy's mission to recover a specific artifact is thus contextualized as a small but significant counteraction in this larger cultural war. The interaction between Indy and Basil Shaw reveals a friendship built on mutual respect for antiquity, a shared language of academic enthusiasm that survives even under gunfire, and Shaw's trembling hands as he handles the dial fragment are the first indication that this particular artifact exerts a dangerous gravitational pull on those who study it. When the young officer played by Thomas Kretschmann appears, his Aryan features and cold efficiency embody the Nazi ideal that Voller will later intellectualize, the brutal physicality of the regime before the calculating scientist refines it into something more insidious. The sequence's escalation, from stealthy infiltration to full-scale running battle, demonstrates Indiana's ability to adapt to rapidly deteriorating situations, an improvisational intelligence that the 1969 sections of the film will test to its breaking point when age and grief have dulled those instincts. The de-aging technology employed for Harrison Ford's face in the prologue is a hybrid of machine learning algorithms trained on Lucasfilm's extensive archival footage, and a new performance captured on set with infrared cameras tracking every muscle movement beneath Ford's skin. ILM's artists spent months painting out the digital seams, adjusting the subsurface scattering of light through simulated younger tissue, and matching the body double's movements to the original trilogy's reference footage. The process was more labor-intensive than traditional CGI character creation because the goal was not to invent a new face, but to reconstruct a specific, historically documented face at a specific age, a digital archaeological project that mirrors the film's own obsession with reconstructing the past. Ford himself performed all the dialogue and close-up acting for the de-aged sequences. Wearing tracking dots and delivering lines with a physical energy, he consciously modulated to approximate his younger self's cadence. A metaperformative challenge that few actors in history have been asked to undertake. The notorious mismatch between the youthful visage and the octogenarian voice is, upon close analysis, less a technical failure than a Brechtian alienation effect. A constant reminder that this is a constructed memory, a digital ghost performing the hero's origin story, while the real, aged body awaits its turn in the narrative. The shift to 1969 proper introduces a soundscape of revolutionary dislocation, with Jimi Hendrix's guitar feedback and the radio chatter of the Apollo mission bleeding through the walls of Indy's apartment as intrusive heralds of a world that has moved past him. The production design of the apartment itself is a character study in clutter and stagnation. The stacks of ungraded blue books, the dusty artifacts used as paperweights, the framed photograph of Henry Jones Sr. watching over his son's decline, and the conspicuous absence of any images of Mutt or Marion, the family he has erased to protect himself from the pain of their loss. Ford plays this scene with a physical economy that borders on the theatrical, refusing to move more than absolutely necessary. His body a monument to depression that communicates resignation in every slouched shoulder and every delayed reaction to stimuli. The delivery of his lecture on Archimedes, delivered decades ago to engage students, now falls on the deaf ears of a generation that sees him as a relic, and his continued insistence on teaching is not passion but inertia. The last habit a broken man has not yet surrendered. When the neighbor's television blares the lunar landing broadcast, the film cuts between Neil Armstrong's One Small Step and Indy's unmoving form, a juxtaposition that equates his stasis with a kind of death, a refusal to take even a symbolic step into a future he never wanted. Helena Shaw's introduction as a disruption to this stasis is staged as an invasion of Indy's carefully maintained tomb. Her bright yellow dress and rapid-fire patter a shock to the monochromatic beige of his domestic prison. Waller-Bridge calibrates her early performance to be deliberately off-putting, weaponizing charm as a manipulation tactic, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes as she assesses Indy's vulnerability with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up wounded prey. Her comment about having learned from the best is a double-edged blade, flattery concealing an accusation, a reminder that Indy's own flexible relationship with legality and property rights created the template she has perfected. The film is aware of this moral inheritance even if Helena is not yet ready to acknowledge it. Her corruption is a dark reflection of his pragmatism, the difference between them a matter of degree rather than kind at this stage of the narrative. When the FBI agents burst into the apartment, the film shifts gears into paranoid thriller mode, the blank-faced government men representing an institutional threat that cannot be outrun or outfought, a new kind of antagonist for a hero whose body no longer permits his old solutions. The New York ticker tape parade sequence is the film's most concentrated visual argument about the chasm between public celebration and private despair, the confetti drifting like incongruous snow over streets where a broken old man rides a horse he cannot fully control toward a confrontation he does not want. The horse, a retired police mount named by its former owners with an undignified moniker, becomes a symbol of Indy's own condition. An animal bred for service now conscripted into chaos, its name a joke Indy refuses to acknowledge. The sight of Vietnam War protesters clashing with parade goers provides a political context that the franchise has rarely engaged so directly, the domestic unrest of 1969 bleeding into the frame as a reminder that the wars Indy fought overseas have spawned children who now fight in the streets at home. When Indy guides the horse into the subway, the transition from the bright, chaotic surface to the dark, orderly tunnels is a visual regression to the cave and temple environments where his skills still function, a momentary return to the subterranean world of traps and shadows that has always been his element. The police pursuit through the station, with Indy navigating obstacles designed for modern commuters rather than ancient priests, is a small-scale, urban echo of the temple sequences that define the franchise, proof that the old tricks still work even if the context has become absurdly mundane. Voller's operation within NASA is depicted with a chilling institutional ordinariness, his laboratory a clean, well-lit space of chalkboards and slide rules that could belong to any mid-century research facility. The American flag that hangs in his office is not ironic. The film understands that Voller's integration into the American scientific establishment was not a secret conspiracy, but an open, documented, and ethically bankrupt policy of the United States government. Mikkelsen plays these scenes with the relaxed confidence of a man who has been validated by history's winners, his Nazi past a minor biographical detail that his new employers have carefully laundered. His team of henchmen are notably multiracial, a deliberate choice that reflects the American military's integration, as well as Voller's ideological flexibility. He needs competent killers, and their ethnic origins are irrelevant to his larger project of correcting the Reich's strategic errors. The film's refusal to soften this historical reality, its insistence on depicting a Nazi comfortably embedded in the American space program, is one of its most politically courageous choices, a rebuke to the sanitized narratives of the post-war period that still dominate popular memory. The scene between Indy and Helena in the hotel bar after the auction betrayal is a masterclass in subtext. Two characters circling each other with dialogue that functions as both confession and interrogation. Helena's explanation of her father's descent into dial-induced madness is delivered with a brittle, defensive humor, her jokes a shield against the grief she has never processed. Indy's response, a rare moment of unguarded sympathy, reveals that he understands obsessive grief better than she realizes, that his own losses have carved a similar hollow space inside him. When he tells her that Basil was a good man destroyed by the dial, he is also delivering a warning she is not yet ready to hear, that she is following the same trajectory, replacing her father's academic obsession with her own mercenary version, and the dial will consume her just as thoroughly. The scene is lit with the warm amber of a dying fire, the shadows on Ford's face emphasizing the deep lines that map his history of pain, and Waller-Bridge's performance softens almost imperceptibly as the scene progresses, the armor of cynicism developing hairline fractures. The Tangier auction house sequence introduces a world of cosmopolitan criminality that has no loyalty to nation or ideology, only to capital. And this moral vacuum is the environment that has shaped Helena into the person she has become. The auctioneer's rapid patter, the numbered paddles, the casual exchange of sums that could fund archaeological expeditions for decades, all create an atmosphere of obscene wealth that treats history as just another asset class. Indy's attempted disruption, a clumsy improvisation that nearly gets him killed, is a painful reminder that his body can no longer execute the plans his mind still generates, the gap between conception and execution widening into a chasm. When Helena sweeps in to save him, her competence is genuinely impressive, a display of quick thinking and physical agility that deliberately echoes younger Indy's best moments, and the film allows the audience to admire her skills even as they recognize her moral vacancy. The escape from the auction, involving a grenade and a well-placed tapestry, is the closest the film comes to classic Spielbergian farce, the violence rendered cartoonish enough to be palatable while still carrying real consequences. Teddy Kumar, played by Ethan Isidore with a preternatural self-possession, is introduced as Helena's miniature double, a child who has learned to pick pockets and hot-wire vehicles before he has learned to read. His relationship with Helena is superficially affectionate but fundamentally transactional. two survivors using each other for mutual benefit in a world that offers no safety net. The film does not sentimentalize this arrangement. It presents Teddy's childhood as a tragedy of necessity, his skills impressive but his situation abominable. A street kid whose only path to survival is through the same criminality that Helena has perfected. When Indy, the old moralist, expresses concern about a child being involved in dangerous operations, Helena's dismissive response reveals the depth of her corruption. She has normalized the abnormal, rationalized the exploitation of a minor, because the alternative is admitting her own complicity in destroying his innocence. Teddy's arc across the film, from Helena's tool to his own agent, is a quiet subplot that mirrors the larger theme of younger generations finding their own moral compass even when their mentors have lost theirs. The Mediterranean diving expedition led by Ronaldo introduces the last of Indy's international network of colleagues, a web of friendships that stretches across decades and continents, each relationship a novel's worth of untold adventures. Ronaldo's boat, a weathered vessel maintained with more love than money, is a floating museum of maritime salvage, its cabins cluttered with recovered amphorae and rusted anchors. Banderas plays the role with a grandfatherly warmth, his philosophical musings about the sea and its secrets suggesting a life spent in dialogue with the deep. The scene where he and Indy share a drink and a moment of silence is a tribute to the friendships of old men, connections that do not require constant conversation because the shared history communicates everything. When the eels begin to swarm the wreck, Ronaldo's concern is practical rather than superstitious, a sailor's respect for the ocean's dangers rather than a horror movie's fear of monsters. His death, moments after emerging from the water, is the film's cruelest narrative turn, a bullet from nowhere that extinguishes a life of quiet dignity and leaves Indy with yet another ghost to carry. The exploration of the Ear of Dionysius cave system represents the film's return to the archaeological procedural that has always been the franchise's most distinctive mode. The puzzle-solving sequences that differentiate Indiana Jones from the pure action of other blockbuster series. The cave's acoustic properties, which allow a whisper at one end to be heard clearly at the other, are a real geological phenomenon that the film exploits for both tension and historical accuracy. Archimedes' association with the cave is a matter of historical record, and the film's speculation about his use of its acoustics for security purposes is a plausible extension of his known ingenuity. The water displacement trap that guards the tomb is a pure expression of Archimedean physics, the principle of buoyancy that the historical figure famously discovered in his bathtub, now weaponized as a puzzle for future visitors. Indy's solution, recognizing that the dragonflies must be hollow because solid gold would have triggered the trap immediately, is a moment of intellectual triumph that requires no physical exertion, proof that his value to the Enterprise is in his mind, not his fists. The tomb's antechamber, with its mechanical dragonflies still buzzing after 2 millennia, is a wonder of production design, the oxidized bronze and intricate gears suggesting a technology so advanced for its time that it borders on the supernatural. The confrontation between Indy and Helena inside the tomb, after she has attempted to leave him trapped, is the emotional nadir of their relationship and the turning point toward its reconstruction. His fury is not the hot anger of a young man, but the cold, disappointed rage of a father figure who has been betrayed by someone he was beginning to trust. He lists her deceptions with the methodical precision of an indictment, each lie a nail in the coffin of their budding relationship. Helena's defense, a desperate insistence that she is only doing what she has always done to survive, collapses under the weight of its own inadequacy. Survival is her excuse, but her actions in the tomb go beyond survival into the territory of casual cruelty. When she finally breaks down and admits that she sold the dial to fund a fantasy of escape from the life her father's obsession created, the confession is raw and unpolished, the first honest thing she has said all film. Indy's decision to trust her again, to bring her fully into the mission rather than leaving her in the cave as she had left him, is an act of grace that the film frames as the bravest choice he makes, a risk of emotional vulnerability that exceeds any physical danger. Waller's seizure of the dial and his exposition of his plan to correct Hitler's mistakes are delivered in a monologue that Mikkelsen carefully modulates to avoid melodrama, his soft, reasonable tone making the content more horrifying than any shouted declaration could achieve. He speaks of Hitler's strategic errors at Stalingrad, his mismanagement of the Atlantic campaign, his personal deterioration in the bunker, as though these were spreadsheet errors to be corrected in a quarterly review. The Nazi officers who accompanied him to the tomb, true believers in the old cause, exchange uneasy glances as their intellectual leader casually dismisses the Führer they swore to die for, and in this moment of internal tension, the film reveals the fundamental instability of fascist ideology. It eats even its own saints when they become inconvenient to the next iteration of power. Waller's plan depends on a misreading of the dial's function, an assumption that it is a general-purpose time navigation device rather than a bespoke mechanism tuned to a single coordinate, and this assumption is the tragic flaw that will destroy him. The flight from Greece to the coordinates Waller has calculated is an interlude of forced proximity between enemies, the Nazi bomber's cramped interior a pressure cooker of competing agendas. The American CIA operatives who have been Waller's handlers begin to realize the scope of his ambition only when it is too late to stop it, their faces registering the dawning horror of complicity in something far beyond the weapons development they had been sold. Mikkelsen plays Waller's anticipation with a slight crack in his usual composure, a childlike eagerness that reveals the fanatic beneath the scientist, the true believer who has been wearing a mask of cold rationality. Indy, bound and helpless, reverts to his only remaining weapon. His voice, needling Waller with questions about continental drift, the variable whose importance slowly dawns on the audience as the plane drones toward its destination. The moment when Helena, having stowed away, emerges to confront her godfather's captor, transforms the scene from a passive transport into an active confrontation, the three central characters finally occupying the same confined space as their philosophies collide. The time portal itself, when it opens in the storm clouds above the ancient Mediterranean, is a visual that draws on centuries of religious painting, the swirling light and apocalyptic geometry suggesting a Renaissance depiction of the heavens opening. Mangold and his effects team made the deliberate choice to represent the fissure as a wound in the sky rather than a clean technological gateway, an organic rupture that bleeds light and wind rather than a stargate or a wormhole. The German bomber, a machine of industrial warfare, is dwarfed by this cosmic phenomenon, its engines sputtering as the laws of physics begin to fracture around it. The sound design in this sequence is extraordinary, the roar of the engines, the shriek of tearing metal, and the unearthly hum of the vortex combining into a cacophony that is both terrifying and sublime. Williams' score drops away almost entirely during the transition, leaving only sound effects and the characters' shouted dialogue, a choice that strips the moment of cinematic comfort and leaves the audience as disoriented as the characters. The emergence over Syracuse, the Roman fleet visible on the horizon, the Greek defenders on the beach, the burning city in the distance, is a reveal that relies on the audience's historical knowledge to deliver its full impact. We know, even if the characters do not, that these Romans are here to conquer, that Archimedes will die in this battle despite his genius, that the city will fall despite the aid the dial has summoned. The film does not linger on the explanation of these stakes. It trusts that the image of ancient war speaks for itself, that the sight of a ballista bolt tearing through a modern aircraft's fuselage is a collision of eras that requires no exposition. The Nazis who survive the crash landing are immediately killed by Greek soldiers who see them only as invaders from the sky, their racial ideological pretensions meaningless in the face of warriors who categorize all strangers as threats. The film grants Waller a death without dignity, his body probably crushed in the wreckage or pierced by a spear off-screen, a deliberate denial of the climactic confrontation that a lesser film would have staged. The dialogue between Indy and Archimedes, conducted in fragments of Koine Greek that Indy has studied and ancient Greek that Archimedes speaks, is a scene of mutual recognition between two old men who have dedicated their lives to understanding the world through different but complementary frameworks. Archimedes sees the watch on the wrist of the crashed Nazi pilot and immediately integrates this data point into his existing model of the universe, a scientist's reflex that does not waste time on astonishment when there is information to absorb. Indy sees the living embodiment of a historical figure he has studied his entire career, and his response is not the giddy enthusiasm of a tourist, but the reverent awe of a pilgrim who has reached his destination. When Archimedes explains that the dial was designed to bring help to Syracuse, he is also revealing the mechanism's true nature as a distress signal, a mathematical cry for aid that has echoed through the centuries until it found an answer in the form of a Nazi plane full of time travelers. The loop is closed, the paradox is resolved not by explanation but by acceptance, and the film trusts the audience to sit with the mystery rather than demanding a schematic diagram. The argument between Indy and Helena on the beach, with the sounds of battle in the distance and the burning ruins of the plain behind them, is the philosophical climax of the entire franchise, a debate about the ethics of staying in the past that distills the film's themes into dialogue. Indy's case is emotionally irrefutable. His son is dead, his wife has left him, his country has betrayed its own values by hiring Nazis, his body is failing, and this beach offers him a death with meaning, a final contribution to human civilization, a chance to help Archimedes defend the city. He lists these reasons not with self-pity, but with a calm, reasoned logic that makes Helena's counter-argument seem almost cruel by comparison. Her case is ethically irrefutable but emotionally unsatisfying. He is needed in the present. His grief is not a sufficient reason to abandon his life, and she is not willing to lose another father figure to the Dial's seductive promise. The film does not declare a winner in this argument. It simply allows both positions their full weight, and when Helena resorts to physical force, knocking him unconscious, the act is framed as a violation that is also an act of love, a paradox that the rest of the film must reckon with. The return to 1969 through the time portal, with Teddy piloting the smaller plane while Helena tends to Indy's unconscious form, is a reversal of the earlier power dynamics, the younger generation now literally steering the course while the old hero lies helpless. Teddy's competence at the controls, learned through a combination of Helena's haphazard instruction and his own innate mechanical intuition, is the culmination of his arc from street urchin to capable agent. The portals closing behind them, sealing the past off from further interference, is a visual finality that the film respects. There will be no return trip, no sequel hook, no suggestion that the adventure will continue. When Indy regains consciousness in his apartment, the disorientation he experiences is not just the fog of a knockout punch, but the psychic whiplash of a man who has seen his heart's desire and been forcibly removed from it. His first coherent question, asking why Helena brought him back, carries an accusation beneath its exhaustion, a sense of violation that the film does not immediately resolve. Marion's entrance into the apartment, announced by the sound of her keys and the rustle of grocery bags, is staged with a mundane ordinariness that makes the reunion more powerful than any orchestrated reveal could. Karen Allen's performance in this scene is an extraordinary example of acting through action rather than dialogue. She does not rush to embrace Indy, does not weep, does not apologize, but simply begins to put away the groceries, to fold the laundry, to reopen the domestic space that has been closed for so long. Her presence is an assertion, not a request, a declaration that she is back and that Indy will have to deal with it on her terms. The film understands that reconciliation between two people who have hurt each other deeply is not a single conversation but a process, and the scene resists the temptation to resolve their entire history in a neat monologue. When she moves toward him, asking where it hurts, the callback to Raiders is earned not by nostalgia, but by the specific, lived-in weight of the decades that have passed since that first injury list. The final frames of the film, with the fedora on the drying rack and the city sounds drifting through the window, are an act of visual poetry that trusts the audience to understand what is being communicated without explicit narration. The drying rack is not a pedestal. It is a piece of domestic furniture, a place where wet things go to become ready for use again. The choice to place the hat there, rather than on Indy's head or in a display case, is the film's final word on the relationship between the man and the legend. Indiana Jones is a role that Henry Jones Jr. played, a costume he wore, a persona that served its purpose and can now be set aside. The sounds outside, the traffic and the sirens and the distant voices, are the sounds of life continuing, a world that does not pause for endings or demand encore performances. The film fades to black not on a triumphant chord, but on a quiet diminuendo, the music settling into a sustained, unresolved note that suggests continuation rather than conclusion, a door left open rather than a book closed forever.